It seems almost unanimous that the best new vehicle to buy is electric, an EV. With their battery power or hybrid power, they have little to no footprint, right? Well, today's episode will be the first one of Inside ESG, but not the last, to discuss the fact that everything has a footprint, carbon or otherwise. Last episode, we learned about the markets for EV battery supplies. Today, let's look at the footprint of producing those raw materials. What are the sustainability profiles of the exploration and production activities that bring us these minerals? What practices are they adopting to optimize their footprint? Today, I'm pleased that we'll return to Benchmark Mineral Intelligence to talk with Charlotte Selvey Miller, head of ESG. Charlotte's team assesses the entire EV supply chain on ESG factors, currently focused on publishing lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite ESG reports on the EV industry that include global baseline life cycle assessments. Stay tuned, we'll drop in on Charlotte in the UK in just a moment. Inside ESG is a timely new production which takes you inside the work of practitioners on the ground, chief risk officers, market analysts, cybersecurity experts, and founders of game-changing startups. We'll talk with specialists in every corner of the globe, across industries and issues, dropping into Argentina to hear about lithium mining, Central Asia for a view of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and West Africa for a perspective on climate risk, among other stops. Hello, Charlotte. Nice to see you again. Your team at Benchmark has been very busy rolling out expanded services for companies across the lithium supply chain, including custom or bespoke life cycle assessments. I first wanted to ask you about your ESG reporting in the sector, which includes assessment of company-specific performance against specific metrics. Which of the metrics are related to critical minerals production versus mining in general or other sectors?
In general, so our database looks at different metrics across the E, so environment, the S, and the G, social and governance. In general, they could be looked at by mining, just any mining companies. It doesn't have to be associated purely just with critical minerals, but we do have more of an emphasis on making that company more net zero, whether there's low carbon technologies on site at that company. Just because we're in this space together, mining companies and converting companies are feeding the minerals that are going to go into electric vehicles and the batteries that make electric vehicles and clean technology. So the spotlight's kind of shining on these mining and converting companies a lot more in this industry than other mining industries at the moment, because the feedstock going into these batteries also needs to be sustainable. It needs to come from companies that are thinking about how they can be net zero, as well as having an electric vehicle that is helping the country be net zero or the globe to be net zero. So yeah, we focus a bit more on net zero plans in place, whether they're verified or not. We look at, on the social side, a bit more about composition of board. And to be honest, I'm not sure if some of these aspects are in general mining, similar tiering mechanisms like what we do. But we're trying to create a bit more balance with gender on the board and in the workforce. Mining in general is very male dominated. So some of the ways to make change and, bring everyone into this transition with us, not just what historically has been a very male dominated space, then we need to be able to make change from the board level. And quite often you will only see change in the rest of the company if the board is very gender balanced as well. So we make sure that gender balance at the board level and within the workforce is included in our methodology. Having an in-house ESG team or committee or even a person is really important for creating change internally as well. So this is important because what we found was that sometimes a company, and again, this can be your normal mining companies or any company actually for any supply chain. Normal companies would have an ESG report or a sustainability report, just something that is public facing that showcases what that company might be doing to either mitigate their risks in terms of environment, social, or governance risks, or to showcase what they are doing to make a positive impact. Sometimes that report is made by an external person as a contractor to come in and find that information out. And actually, their company doesn't have an in-house sustainability director or any sustainability team. So that's really important, again, because it showcases change within the company. Like the company's really prioritizing spending that money in-house, having a team or a personal committee to make that change within their company rather than outsourcing it externally. So some of these points there are what we help classify companies as being like a high tier or high achieving ESG company compared to a low tier or low achieving ESG company.
Hi, it's Maureen Upton, host and producer of the Inside ESG podcast. I hope you're enjoying this episode. I wanted to take a moment to tell you about Inside ESG's advisory services. If your team could use expert advice in ESG strategy and integration, performance against different metrics and frameworks, or workshop design and facilitation, visit insideesg.com/advisory to see how we might be able to help. Or email info@insideesg.com. See the show notes for links. Now, let's get back to our episode. What types of stakeholders do you find are most interested in the reporting? Is it electric vehicle buyers, investors, regulators, others?
Yeah, so at the moment, we've had a lot of uptake from both upstream, so your miners and converters, and the downstream, so both from battery manufacturers and from your automakers, like electric vehicle companies. So the reasons they are both interested are for two different reasons. I'll start with the upstream. So they're interested in because they want to be able to benchmark themselves against their peers. So they might have a really low carbon technology that they use in their processing, which means that they have low carbon emissions or low global warming potential, as you might say from a life cycle assessment perspective. They might showcase that on their ESG report, but it's good to have a third party like Benchmark to be able to assess them in terms of their competitors or their peers and rank them basically on how well they're doing in comparison to others. So they can then use that information either to the public or to internally or investment presentations, just to showcase that the work they have doing has been recognised by us. It also might help what else they need to achieve. What are their peers doing that they're not doing? Like not many companies at all in lithium, which has had a lot of attention at the moment. It's one of the main minerals needed for these electric vehicle batteries. Only 9.5% of all of the companies, so that's mining companies and converting companies, both in development, so not yet in production, and in operation. So 9.5% of all those companies have net zero plans. So it's a really low number. And for cobalt, it's a lot higher. It's 42% of companies have net zero plans. And for nickel, it's only 1.5% for refined nickel and 14% for nickel sulfate. So overall, like refined nickel and lithium have some of the lowest numbers of having net zero plans for their company themselves. If you were a company that said that they did have a net zero plan and it was verified by a third party that the plan was reaching science-based targets, then you could say, we are one of this like 9% of companies that have this net zero plan, and they're kind of leading the way in it. And that's really important for them to be able to do. On the flip side, on the downstream side, they are interested in using our reporting and the tiering system that we have in place for companies to kind of use it as a procurement tool or a responsible sourcing tool. So most of the time, battery makers and OEMs or EV makers will have a responsible sourcing team, their own policy, but a lot of it is like hard lifting work. So, for just example, for lithium, there's 250 companies that we track every quarter, and that goes up and down depending on new developers that are joining the kind of pool, or ones that have fallen off. Maybe they lost funding and they don't exist anymore. So we track all of these companies every quarter, and there's 250 in just lithium. Nickel is about 118, cobalt about 120. So it's a lot of time taken by really looking into detail of these companies, and across all those 65 different metrics. What are they doing? How are they performing? And sometimes, these responsible sourcing teams in both battery manufacturers and EV companies have a lot more minerals to look at, a lot more materials, not just critical minerals, and then they're looking at aluminium as well. They might be looking at aluminium for the rest of the car, and many other materials that will go into it, rubber for the tires, and all of these things they have to be able to responsibly source as well, not just critical minerals. So we provide basically a helping hand and a first point of call, and of reducing the amount of companies that they can then look at, maybe in a little bit more detail before they go and do site visits and things like that. So yeah, we see that it helps both ends of the supply chain at the moment.
Hi, it's Maureen Upton from Inside ESG. You might have heard me mention the Battery Brunch before, a live monthly event on LinkedIn with leading industry speakers and breakout rooms so you can make new connections. It's put on by the Volta Foundation, the largest battery industry community, which also provides research, newsletters, and career fairs. See the show notes for links. Now, let's get back to our episode. Regarding the benchmark developed critical minerals sustainability index, I assume that could be used as sort of a shorthand for companies that may be for users that aren't always wanting to delve into the full ESG report. They can take a quick look at this index, as we all do for stock market indices and other quick forms of measurement.
There is no other sustainability index for critical minerals at the moment, so it is a gap. There used to be one, but it kind of folded a few years ago.
I can imagine the amount of work that goes into it, having worked on different sustainability frameworks before. On the question of the life cycle assessment work, which I've also done, and in the mining industry, I know how difficult and complicated that can be, and a lot of the challenges, what to include and what not to include, which comes back to materiality. What surprises have you encountered?
The Just Energy Transition Partnership, or JETP, which is a group of kind of richer countries, part of the G7, kind of got together, made this partnership to be able to decrease the amount of fossil fuels that Indonesia rely on for their energy mix. So their target is to increase renewable energy in the electricity mix up to 34%, which should, in theory, really help reduce the amount of carbon emissions that nickel processing or even the mining side, mainly the processing side of producing these minerals, so that kind of carbon emissions are lower throughout that battery's life, going upstream. But when you bring that 34% reduction, 34% renewable energy into the LCA, because so little really in the grand scheme of things is relied on by just electricity, it only reduced the carbon emissions by 3.2%, which I don't think was the answer that everybody kind of wanted. And the reason for that is because there's so much processing and heat that's needed where you have to burn fossil fuels. It's not just our scope 2 emissions, which is your electricity use, but also your scope 1 or direct emissions, which you can't reduce by bringing in renewable energy. You'd have to change your processing. So that I found that quite interesting, that things are trying to be changed, especially with different initiatives such as this Just Energy Transition Partnership, but it isn't enough on its own.
And I think that's the error that a lot of people make in discussing carbon footprints and other footprints is that you have to look at the entire footprint. It can be deep in one area and look very good in another area. I'm also done quite a bit of work in Indonesia, so I know the challenges with marine life, but also know about their amazingly talented mining sector. I just wanted to ask you, because you're recently back from Benchmark's event in Washington, D.C., the Battery Gigafactories Conference. What were some of the most interesting takeaways?
Lots of it was about labor issues in the US. So having the right workforce there to then start working in these gigafactories or the processing plants. So I've heard that kind of companies were trying to get Japanese workers over to start working on these processing plants to get the ball rolling. But it seemed that that's a major issue, that it's gone from nothing and then the IRA's come in place to then start going at full speed, but we haven't actually trained any workforce to at the standards that everybody needs before. So yeah, that's kind of lacking. So that was something that I didn't really expect. And but I guess it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're not training up people in this area, then they can't just like pluck someone out of thin air to say, hey, come and run this gigafactories plant for us.
I would imagine that there's somewhat similar phenomenon going on around the EU's Critical Minerals Act. Perhaps the policy making is out at the forefront, and then the workforce development has to catch up.
Yeah, it does. Actually, another thing that came up was that I know it was always mentioned that the US was like trying to catch up with the EU policy and China on the site on EVs and implementing different policies to increase EV demand and then the supply of these minerals. But actually now the US has definitely overtaken the EU in terms of having the right policy in place. That was another theme, that it's now the EU that are behind, because the IRA's done a great job, to be honest, because it's incentivizing companies to start up, whereas the EU have taken the opposite role, and they've gone down the fining people route if they don't do something. So there's two
Right.
opposite kind of policies, and incentivizing through benefits or fining people. So it's interesting to see how that might pan out.
So the carrot versus the stick. I guess we'll have to look at what evidence comes in for which one works faster, to the extent that you can isolate those two approaches and from all other factors. But well, Charlotte, I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining me today. It was great talking with you, and I really look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It was great to, it's always great to chat about critical minerals and sustainability. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. To make sure you don't miss out on our next episode, subscribe to the Inside ESG podcast on Spotify or any podcast platform, the YouTube channel, the LinkedIn newsletter, and our mailing list on InsideESG.com. See you next time.